Well, good evening. My name is Rebecca Blair. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the engagement specialist with Friendly House Elder Pride Services. We work to enhance the lives of LGBTQ plus older adults through education, advocacy, support, and community building services. Thank you for joining us tonight for part four, the final part of our Planning with Pride series, Meaningful Ceremonies of Mourning and Remembrance. Our intentions with these presentations is to provide information about end-of-life needs, services, and options available from the mouths of professionals working in these areas, and we hope that this opens up a community-wide conversation about death and dying, choice, and meaning. The organizers of this series all agree that the LGBTQ plus community of all ages needs better access to this important information. And to best facilitate that, we will be recording the presentation part of our program tonight to be shared later via Friendly House's YouTube page. We will stop the recording after our presenters have finished, and then we will facilitate a conversation with the speakers tonight. Please feel free at any time during the night to type your questions into the Q&A or the chat, which will be enabled at various points tonight, and we will read them for you. You can also raise your virtual hands during that time, and we will unmute you so you can ask your question. Once we're able to address all the questions in the room, we'd love to open things up if you'd like to share any of your personal experiences with this topic. Near the end of our conversation tonight, we will draw tonight's raffle prize, a 3-hour consultation with one of our speakers, Holly Pruitt, who I will introduce first. Hi, Holly. Holly is a longtime lesbian activist and organizer who for the past 12 years has served the community as a funeral and wedding celebrant, home funeral guide, death doula, and community death educator. She's the co-creator of the non-commercial public information site, Oregon Funeral Resources and Education, and recently led a year-long community remembrance project, No on 9 Remembered, which was featured by the American LGBTQ Plus Museum. Tonight, we also have Carol Brownlow, who is a retired educator and director of gerontology program at Chemeketa Community College, an end-of-life planning workshop facilitator, and a longtime volunteer for Friendly House Elder Pride Services. Welcome, Carol. And Jamie Thrower is back for another session with us. Jamie is a queer death doula, an end-of-life educator, and grief guide in Portland, Oregon, and is also creator of Queer Grief Club, facilitating activity-focused grief support experiences for the LGBTQ plus community. She weaves her grief and death work with her passions for gardening, mixed media art, and writing. Jamie specializes in working with the LGBTQ plus community, parent loss, and medical aid in dying. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And if you could start the screen share so that we have an overview slide, we'll let you know what we have in mind for tonight. But before we dive in, on behalf of all of us presenters, Rebecca, we want to thank you so much, along with Friendly House Elder Pride Services, for your expert hosting of this 4-part series. And also want to give a shout out to our friends at Evening Star End of Life Doulas for initiating the idea of creating this educational programming for the LGBTQ plus community. So thank you all. So on slide 2, Rebecca, is the overview of what we had in mind for tonight. We want to start by talking about why does planning matter when it comes to how we honor our dead in the queer community. And then why have a ceremony? It's become very common for a death to occur without there being any ritual or ceremony of any kind. We'll talk about when to have a ceremony, and just spoiler alert, there's no right or wrong answer. So we're going to give you examples throughout the continuum, before, during, and after, basically. And then some how-tos for how to think about putting together a ceremony. And then, of course, questions and discussion. But if we can go to the next slide, Rebecca, we want to start just by taking a moment to really enter into this space of remembrance together. So if you'd like and you're comfortable, you might feel your feet on the ground, and you might take maybe a deeper breath than you've been taking over the last few moments. And if you choose, I want to invite you just to bring into your mind and perhaps your heart some of the people whose deaths have touched you, deaths in the past, deaths in the very recent past, perhaps anticipated deaths, people who are in their dying time, living with a terminal diagnosis. That may include some of us here, people befriending their mortality, the deaths that we may be anticipating, including our own, the deaths that might serve as our teachers for how we approach our own deaths, those that we remember as perhaps a touchstone for how we might like to be remembered. And we just want to honor all of those who are here with us through memory, through our grief and our love, through however we may feel their presence tonight. And Rebecca, if the chat is open, we want to invite you, if you'd like to type in a name of someone who is on your mind, on your heart, someone you're remembering tonight as we talk about ceremonies of bereavement and remembrance. And we can read those names out. Jamie, if you'd help me as we start to see those.
Yeah, we have Patricia Little, Val. I'm going to throw in Billy and Jim and Bertie.
Yeah. Be talking tonight about Linda and Marcy, about Amazon,
Monica Roberts, Mary, Emma. We've got Deb and John and Reggie,
Letitia, my sister Judy,
Randy, Adelaide.
yeah. And you may be just calling those names on your own. We have Anne, granddaughter Elemento Haight, Diane Hibbard. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Mom, Yvonne Zinkin, Keith Gann. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We wish that we could hear all of their stories. We wish that we could be together more physically in a space of remembrance, but thank you for helping to broaden the circle as we start tonight. Rebecca, if you could pause the slideshow, we're going to transition with this fullness of our hearts to Carol, who's going to set the stage with her perspective on why this is so important. Carol?
Thank you, Holly. My name is Carol Brownlow. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and it's nice to be with you again. When we were planning this series, I thought I would just share in the first one on the importance of planning, but here I am back again. Two incidents have occurred since that first webinar that prompted me to ask for a little time during this session to once again emphasize the importance of pre-planning all elements of the end-of-life decisions, and especially the final celebration of life or funeral. In the last month, there was an article in our local newspaper, The Oregonian, sharing that a gay couple had done their planning as advised, and at the request of the dying partner, there was agreement to have his parents plan the funeral. The parents were delighted to do that, but much to the shock and horror of the survivor, when he attended the funeral, he heard the minister proclaiming that his husband was burning in hell because of his sinful life. He was devastated. You know, the LGBTQ plus community is currently having some very negative experiences. So we must be super vigilant at this time that this doesn't happen to you or yours. Also, as a queer person, you be sure to have an opportunity to state whether or not you want to share your sexual orientation at your celebration. If you've lived your entire life in the closet, you may prefer to continue to keep that secret. You don't have to come out. Or you may want to share how you identify your gender, male, female, trans, non-binary, etc. And how do you want your significant other referenced? My wife, husband, lover, life partner, or other? Share if you were married and for how long. These are questions that may not occur to the individual who's helping you arrange the celebrations. They're not the usual questions on the forms that are prepared by a lot of funeral directors. The other incidents occurred when I attended a celebration of life for a longtime friend that was hosted by her niece. And several of us drove to Eugene for what we assumed would be a sharing of stories about our friend and have an opportunity to say why she had been so important in our lives. She had been a basketball coach, in Alaska that had won the state championship. And several of her former ball players had flown to Oregon to pay their respect. She also had a cousin who had driven to Texas, from Texas for the event. So after about 2 hours of just kind of milling around, we finally asked the niece if we're going to sit and talk about Peg. No, she said, I don't want to interrupt the conversations. So other than the loop of family photos on the TV, there was no opportunity to really celebrate the deceased. It felt more like going to a cocktail party than a celebration. And we drove back to Portland very disappointed and feeling like she deserved better. We had gone there to share and to celebrate, and we didn't really have an opportunity to do that. Now, so that's why we really encourage you to make your preferences known. Now, there's no guarantee that they will be honored, but chances are better than if you leave it up to others to make those decisions for you. So know what you want, share what you want. And then one last topic for me is a reminder that if you prefer a traditional religious ceremony, it will be important to make additional decisions. You know, for example, if you're Catholic, do you have a preference of the celebrant? What priest do you want to do this? Can communion be served in the venue that you've selected? That will depend on where you have the celebration. Can communion be served in the venue that you've selected? Do you have friends who are Eucharistic ministers who can help with that? I just want to say decisions. There are so many, and I'm hopeful that these reminders will be helpful. Now back to our major presenters.
Thank you, Carol. And I know about Major, you have outlined such important cautionary tales and tips, and those kind of nightmare scenarios are what motivates Jamie and myself and others, I think, to do the work that we do, right? Let us help you pull it off in a way that feels authentic to your lives. So my start into doing this work, partnering with people to help them design ceremony and ritual, came out of my own sort of disappointing story, which was when my dad was about my age, in his early 60s. He was diagnosed with a terminal brain cancer, and I was one of his primary caregivers for the 18 months from his diagnosis to his death. But after he died at home under hospice care, the removal service came and zipped him into a body bag right in front of me and carried him away in a gurney. And that was it. There was no funeral or memorial or grief ceremony of any kind. I was given a yogurt container of some of his ashes and some of his personal effects. And thankfully, my roommate at the time was a gay man who had a strong affinity for Wiccan practice. And he helped me about 6 months later come up with a grief ritual. It was really kind of a coming of age ceremony for me as a fatherless daughter at that time, more than a memorial service for my dad. But once I undertook training as a celebrant, I was able to write my dad the obituary that I never had, and have done a number of other never too late observations once my own imagination was expanded through all of the amazing families and communities that I was working with. So many of us have, as I said, experienced a death where there was no ritual or ceremony for a variety of reasons. You know, we're in a time where many of us live far away from the place that our family and traditions, or we've left behind the religious practices that may have been conventional wherever we grow up, or we may have been shut out of those. We may have been excluded from them, or there may just be a lot of family complications, logistical complications, financial complications, or simply the grief feels too much. How can I how can I pull something like this off in the depth of grief? So there are a lot of reasons not to do it, including not having the built-in team. If you don't have the church ladies to do the luncheon in the fellowship room, then it's can be a lot of work to figure out. But the amazing thing about being part of the queer community is that we have always come up with such creative responses. And I remember working with a lesbian 10 years ago who was anticipating her own death. She had a terminal illness and was going to use medical aid and dying. And she said, I learned from my brothers during AIDS that it's not about a funeral anymore. It's about a celebration of life. They taught us how to celebrate life, and that's what I want. And so just as we came up with commitment ceremonies before the idea of a same-sex legal union was ever imagined, and gender affirming ceremonies, renaming ceremonies, and the list goes on, we can also reinvent. A lesbian writer friend of mine calls it new ways to walk through old portals, because the needs are always with us, but we have to invent the ways of meeting those needs that really feel authentic to us right now. So if Rebecca, you could start the slide share again, we'll look at a few perspectives on the function that ceremony and ritual can serve, and then hear Jamie's thoughts on this. Robert Fulghum describes rituals as cairns that mark the path behind us and ahead of us. Without them, he says, we lose our way. Eileen London and Belinda Recio describe ritual as a journey with the sacred as the destination. In their view, ritual binds us to the whole of creation, and it's in this bond, they believe, we can encounter the sacred. The poet David White says that the death of anyone close to us is always a form of salutation, a simultaneous goodbye to their physical presence, and a deep hello to the more intimate, imaginal relationship now beginning to form in their absence. And I think a good ceremony of bereavement, of grief, and remembrance serves that midwife function to transition from the relationship of the physical embodied presence to the relationship that is ongoing in other forms. And lastly, the Indigenous activist and writer Martine Prechtel talks about the collective function of grief in a healthy community and culture. To truly and freely grieve as an entire people, he says, can revive an entire culture just as much as bringing back to life an individual. So Rebecca, if we can stop the screen share, Jamie's got some additional thoughts here on the function of ritual and ceremony.
Yeah, rituals and ceremonies really allow us to kind of take action and participate in our grief and loss in this new and different way. And I just read something actually recently where someone described the reason that we do rituals is because, when someone dies and we're feeling this immense grief, we often feel like things are happening to us. They're happening to us and there's nothing that we can do and things are out of our control. But when we're doing a ritual, we are the doing, and we are able to have a little bit of that control back. We're able to, dig into something that is physical, because grief is also, it's life and death are such a huge mystery, and you have to go from this world where your person was to a world where they aren't, and how do you make sense of that? So rituals and ceremonies allow us to kind of get into our creativity and to be able to move and work our grief in a way that's different than just being able to just thinking about it. So whenever I'm working with people who are wanting to do ceremonies, wanting to put together rituals, we're thinking about other considerations for how you shape a ritual, how you shape a memorial service. Do you have someone's body? We don't always get a choice in that, but if you do, what is the significance for you of having someone's body? If you don't have their body, or if that's something that you don't want, are there other ways for you to, you know, memorialize them in a way that still feels really meaningful to you. Maybe you have an article of their clothing or a pair of their shoes or something that, you know, a plant that meant a lot to them. I think that, you know, because there are no rules in grief, and that if you can take away anything from this session, I hope that you take away that, like, there are so many possibilities for the way that you can think about and memorialize someone, and that you can work within your own grief, and that you can also, if you're planning for yourself, there are just unlimited creative ways, and there are no rules. And so you get to really kind of dig in. That's been the beauty of our community. Like Holly said, from the beginning of time, like, we have never, you know, been a part of what is our normal, you know, heteronormative society. And so we get creative, we think outside the box, we create our own realities, and this beautiful existence that we live now. So why can't we do that in death? And so another piece also that I like to always talk about is that, you know, family and memorial services or funerals and rituals can be a complicated thing for our community. And, you know, I personally have experienced, you know, having a friend pass away who in their last few years of life, that we didn't know were their last few years of life, they had really just embraced this new kind of queer identity and non-binary identity, and we're really proud of that. And when they died unexpectedly, the funerals and everything that was done, the rituals that were done after their death, were done by their family that was back in the South. And so there was a lot of misgendering, it was using the wrong name. And so a lot of friends and I, who, you know, part of this person's community, felt like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel like we're honoring our person who we knew, and who we think that they would have wanted to be seen as their whole selves. So, you know, I remind people too that there's no one way to grieve, and there's also no one way to have a memorial service, and you can have more rituals and different things, you know, beyond it. There does not have to just be one. And I, you know, families can be complicated, and I genuinely believe that people should be able to grieve in their own ways. And so instead of, you know, disrupting a family's processing, even if they weren't able to show up for the way that their person needed them, or were not able to see them in their whole queer self, you can still do alternative ceremonies, a different memorial that really embodies, you know, who your person was. And then there's also ways to blend both of those things, you know, just kind of like Carol was saying, you know, if you have traditional religious background, like, and that's important to you or important to your family, but you know, you also have other pieces, like there are ways to weave it all together and to kind of create you know, everything that you would want in a service kind of together. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Jamie, and your sweet kitty's getting a shout out.
Yeah, Sylvia is very passionate about end of life and queer grief, so she's always like, oh, are you talking? Here I come.
Yeah. It feels so good to have her here. Rebecca, if you could put our slide share back up. And I Jamie, so appreciate everything that you just spoke to. I feel like pretty much every day the words come out of my mouth, no one ceremony will meet all needs. And so this is, I think, the kind of palette that we're trying to inspire people to think about, of you know, different ways to meet the particular needs within our community experience. So we're going to share some examples now, just to continue to just kind of populate our collective imaginations about what's possible across this time spectrum of before a death, what's sometimes called a living memorial, The vigil that is now, many end-of-life doulas are referring to the presence that may happen during a dying time, but a vigil also often refers to what can happen in the presence of the body after the death, also known as a viewing or a wake, or when sitting Shiva, the body may not be present, but the gatherings in the immediate time after the death. The funeral is technically the reference to a ceremony that happens with the body present, perhaps in conjunction with the interment of the body in terms of burial in the ground or cremated ashes going into a niche. Memorial or celebration of life typically are the terms used when the body's no longer present. It's not about the final disposition of the body at that point. And then there's such a range of different kinds of remembrance rituals. So we'll give some examples for that. So let's start, Rebecca, on the next slide with the idea of a living memorial. And so on this slide, I'm sharing with permission some examples. In the center is my friend Don, who at the time was turning 80. He was a Buddhist hospice chaplain. And he decided to mark his 80th birthday, even though it was in very good health, no terminal diagnosis, but he recognized he was entering a very different chapter of his life. And he wanted to bring to a conscious end the roles that he had held earlier in his life. And he said, if there's going to be a memorial service to me and all of my communities from the different parts of my life are going to get together and we're going to review my life and look at photos, I want to be there. I want to be on this side of the veil when that happens. And so he brought together all the parts of his community and reviewed his life and got to hear people talk about the impact that his life had had on theirs and step across the threshold into the next chapter of his life. The other two photos on the right are from a friend who was very beloved in the community as a teacher. And by the time he came to terms with the fact that he was dying and wanted to say goodbye to people, he was physically too frail to have a lot of one-on-one encounters that were bound to be very emotional. And so we issued an invitation to his community to try to distill to 1 to 3 words the gift that his life had represented, what they had learned from him, kind of his legacy. And then also 1 to 3 words or phrases of farewell, of blessing, words to say goodbye. And we printed them out on cards. And when we came together in a community space, he sat silently. And instead of people kind of doing an open mic, very emotional, we passed around the cards and we read them one at a time to create this beautiful wave and cascade of all of this praise and all of these blessings. And then we strung them together and hung the words of praise testifying to his life's impact in the community space in his house, where the people who were coming and going with food and respite care for his caregivers could see that. His children and grandchildren could see that. And the words of farewell were hung in his room where he lay dying. And then both strands went into his cremation casket when he was cremated. And then the last example that comes to mind is actually from Carol's community, where I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time and hearing a lot of stories. And several people shared with me how a member of the community was dying. And that was often treated with great privacy. I mean, you don't want to presume that that's something to gossip about or talk about and to kind of give privacy to the family, but her family was from the South, and it was part of their tradition to throw open the doors and to have everybody come in and to have people visit and to have people say goodbye. And it had such an impact on the other members of the community to be a part of that cultural tradition of hers, to meet her family and for them to get to hear about who she had been in community with them. So those are just a few examples. And Jamie, I know you have some thoughts on how living memorials can serve with our grief.
Yeah. Living memorials are so beautiful because they do help with what is called anticipatory grief, which is kind of the grief that you are feeling, that wide range of emotions as you are either staring down, the end of your life, or you are, companioning somebody else at the end of theirs. And so being able to engage in that way and to work with someone to tell them, what they mean to you, and also for that person to receive that is so powerful. And it also, again, like you are giving yourself kind of permission to be a part of that process. Oftentimes we feel that end of life, anything end of life, and then also, funeral memorial service, that like our society tells us to take a step back and that, just let the professionals handle it. And a lot of people end up feeling like they don't know what to do and they don't know how to be involved. And so when you are when you unlock that permission to really play a participating role, either in the end of your own life, but also in the end of somebody else's. There's so many different ways that you can engage in ritual or ceremony, while someone is still alive, and to help with that anticipatory grief, to be able to come together and to, share the things that you would want to share, and to be able to hear the impact. Like, I just think like what a profound thing and gift, that story that you just shared about writing down messages on the cards, and then not only does the person get to see them and view them, but their community did too. And that is another part, is that all, community members, when we are grieving together, we're sharing that load. And that's a really, really beautiful part of, any destructive or death or, hard thing, is that you see sometimes the worst in people, and you oftentimes see the best in people. And when you are in that community and feeling really held in that, it doesn't make the pain of grief go away, it can help lighten that load a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I was privileged to work with a 40-year-old woman who had terminal cancer and wanted to put some pieces in place for her after death care, knowing that her spouse would find it very, very overwhelming. And so I shared with her a series of questions that she might reflect on that covered a lot of the considerations that we're talking about here. And she said, well, how can I possibly figure this out myself? I'm going to throw a pizza party and have all my girlfriends come so that we can talk about this. And she invited me to come and witness and sort of support the conversation. And what we talked about, it was like building the grief muscles together and breaking that silence around, instead of just people encouraging her to kick cancer's ass, to
Right.
be in the presence of the death that would be coming. And when her eventual celebration of life happened, several of those girlfriends who had been part of that came up to tell me that it had been an absolutely transformative experience in terms of how they were able to walk forward with her. So Rebecca, if we can go to the next slide, just want to move to this space around the dying time and after death. And used with permission, here are photos of another beloved community icon, queer icon, Marcy Westerling, founder of the Rural Organizing Project. And at the 1-year anniversary of her terminal cancer diagnosis, she called it her cancerversary, she wrote a letter to what she called her sisterhood, her closest women friends, and said how she would want her death to be attended, although she hoped that would be a long time away. And she hoped that because she was walking towards it first, that we all might learn something, since she was ever the teacher and organizer. And when she got closer to her death, she tasked her sister with creating a burial shroud for her, and her brother with creating the lowering board. He mailed it from a tree on his property. And then after her last exhale, we gathered through the night to wash her body and dress her and start to erase some of the items that she had indicated she wanted to go into her green burial casket. And throughout the next day, her closest ones came to spend their time with her body. And in that kind of space, when people are sitting and sharing stories and being able to absorb the reality of the death, other things can happen, like the decoration of a casket, of a cardboard cremation casket, if that's brought to the space. In Marcy's case, the cemetery provided the transportation of her body in one of their kind of generic white vans, but all the kids in her life decorated it with crepe paper so that it would be a festive ride to send it off. And Jamie, of course, in your work as a doula, you do a lot to support the kind of space around the dying time as well, and people's ability to engage with that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's to me, like, it's so beautiful to watch this kind of click for people when they really do feel empowered to engage in that way, and to also include other folks and their community and their friends and family and loved ones. And I similarly worked with someone who they had a very distinct plan for what it was going to look like during their vigil time, which involved having someone playing like 80s hair band music, but on a violin. And there were the room needed to be decorated with flowers, and they wanted their specific, they had a group of 4 girlfriends that they traveled the world together. And so they really wanted to all, be together. And so after she died, she had requested that we put all these family photos on her body to cover it with scarves and flowers, her childhood teddy bear. And that's what she wanted to go off to the funeral home with. And, there was one of the friends who I had talked to earlier about it, and she had kind of shared her reservations of, I've never been with someone when they died, and that scares me. And I'm not sure I can really do this. And I'm going to try, but I'm not really sure. And that was totally okay. But in watching other people kind of start to engage in that way, she suddenly got right in there, and afterwards was like, this was so helpful. It really made me feel connected to her and made me feel like it was really the send-off that she wanted. And so being able to kind of create these really special experiences for the dying person, and for, their support people is really, it can be so connective. And also, like you're teaching people kind of how to integrate grief, and then we're also showing each other how to show up in these difficult times of death and vigil, the vigil time. And, how do we sit to be uncomfortable and to fully focus on our person, when you have a guideline, when someone's told you, this is what's important to me, this is what I want when I'm dying, and maybe I don't know what's going on around me, but like, this is the environment I would like, or I would like you to have people share stories, even if I'm asleep, I want to still hear that. It really also, it unlocks so many ways for the support people to really engage in that too. And without having to guess or worrying that you're doing the wrong thing, because, the wishes have been known and talked about.
Yeah. Thanks, Jamie. Rebecca, our next slide, moving along this time continuum, illustrates the comment that I see by Greg in our chat as part of the queer community. Advocacy has been an important part of our history, so it shouldn't be a surprise that advocacy sometimes needs to be continued after the death of a loved one. So I could not do this webinar without bringing into the room our Shiro Linda Campbell, who was a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. And when her wife, Nancy, was diagnosed with terminal cancer, they wanted nothing more for her to be buried in the military cemetery where Linda would end up as a veteran, under a headstone that was just like the one that Linda's parents were buried under, that said "Together Forever." Linda's father was a veteran, and her mother was able to be buried with him due to the spousal benefits that were accorded to opposite-sex married couples. But they figured, as a same-sex married couple whose marriage wasn't recognized by the federal government at that time, this was just something they were going to have to let go of until she crossed paths with then Labor Commissioner in Oregon, Brad Avakian, who then brought in U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley, and the two of them approached the U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs and petitioned him to change the rules nationally to allow burial in military cemeteries of same-sex spouses. And so this was a tremendous victory for Linda, but there was another piece that didn't feel right to her, which is that the range of symbols that are allowed on military headstones, traditional religious symbols for the most part, the Star of David, the Christian cross, also Masonic temple affiliation and so forth, none of them represented their spirituality. And so she petitioned for the sandhill crane to be added because they mate for life and there were no other nature symbols. And that was approved. And now there are flocks of sandhill cranes in many veteran cemeteries across the country. But having fought those political battles actually then returned Linda to her grief, because now it was finally time to bury Nancy and to really absorb the fullness of her grief there. And she had no idea how to go about doing it. And I said, Linda, you have an amazing team. I mean, the friends around her, the reporters who were covering this, the advocates, in the elected officials' office. And she said, yeah, but I don't have a captain for the team. And that's what she asked me to do, because often it takes someone who's just a few steps removed to be able to be that creative partner and help with kind of the project management, to reflect back, here's what I see you wanting, and help to partner to make it happen. So after Nancy was buried in the cemetery, and then later we returned for the stone setting. And if you can go to the next slide, Rebecca. Linda's story was told. She put together a speech called Do Ask, Do Tell, that not only was about her life coming out of the closet after her military service, but also about the advocacy required after death. And she gave it at the Gay and Gray conference that year. And then her community, she lived at the Mirabella, said, well, we want to hear your story too. So she delivered her speech to a packed house there too. And so many people came up to her afterwards to talk about their queer grandkids or their own coming out story. It created permission in her whole community. And then when Linda's own death approached about 5 years later, her family was able to draw on all of Linda's perspective about life and about how to approach death and what she wanted for Nancy's death rituals, and to replicate many of those aspects. And so the headstone that Nancy had been buried underneath was replaced now with a joint headstone that read just as Linda had envisioned, with her parents' headstone, together forever. And she was buried with full military honors, but there was this huge celebration of her life back at the Mirabella where she had lived, and copies of her speech, commemorative copies, Do Ask, Do Tell, Linda's story, were the commemorative keepsake that were handed out at her celebration of life. So let's just keep the slide here while we share a few other examples of memorial celebrations of life, just to illustrate the full range. So of course, we all were aware of the huge impact of Darcel's life, Darcel's death, standing room only, complete, free sellout at the largest venue in town, practically. And from that to the very small, just living room or community park rituals where it's just friends gathering because they haven't been able to be a part of, how the person is honored, or maybe the person's family of origin actually didn't do anything. And in between, one of my favorite examples is a friend who was widowed, and her wife had been beloved in several geographic communities across the country. And so folks put on celebrations of life in 5 different places, and her widow was able to go on this amazing healing road trip journey, packing up samples of her wife's art to give away and bringing portions of her ashes and the slideshow that she'd put together. And each community celebration was totally different because they knew her wife in a different way or from a different time in her life. I mentioned the friend who was anticipating her own death through using medical aid and dying that said, I want a celebration of life like my gay brothers. I'm hiring you to help my daughter because I'm reconciled with my death, but my daughter is devastated and she's going to need help. But the two things I want, I know the venue I want, and I want there to be dancing, and I have a playlist. And when I met with her daughter, she's like, no, we can't dance. I mean, we are going to be so destroyed. We're going to be so devastated. How does she think we're going to dance? And so we came up with the idea of putting the playlist on CDs. You can see this was a little while ago. So everybody could get a CD. And I said, well, after we do the program that, is a ceremony of grief and that tells the story of your mother's life, perhaps we could just start the playlist as a kind of walkout music, like a way to get people up and out of their chairs. And the very first song was Bob Marley's Three Little Birds, Every Little Thing is Going to Be All Right. And you kind of can't help but move your body, and everybody started dancing. And we ended up with the dance party that her mother had had, but it had to come organically after the other needs were met in the room. Jamie, what do you have to share in terms of some of these specific examples of memorial celebrations of life?
Yeah, I was thinking of something similar. I recently went back east to help with a memorial service that was, unfortunately, it was a young person who was murdered, and their family, she had died about a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, and her family had done a small funeral kind of back in her home state, but really her community and where she loved to be was in New York. And so I worked with the sisters in planning this bigger memorial service that they really wanted to be not only, a celebration of her life, but really kind of a call to action of continuing her legacy. She was a fashion designer. She was wildly talented. And really like impacted so many people. And so, they had, the sisters in themselves were like very creative as well. And, wanted to have it be more like a party, but also with the kind of structure of a memorial service, so it's not just like a bunch of people kind of hanging out and going, I'm not sure what we're doing here. So there was, the kind of more formal ceremony, which was really like, people assigned people who are sharing their stories. But there was this beautiful altar that was made of her stuff, clothes and shoes and things that she had made, things that were on her own personal altar. There were mannequins with a lot of her designs, a really beautiful kind of looping video of childhood videos and videos from behind the scenes at runway shows. And it really gave kind of people this different way to engage in the community and also kind of come together and say, like, how are we going to continue this legacy? And then the sisters also wanted this other part of the ceremony that they knew would be smaller and a little more intimate, but they wanted something to kind of memorialize or to honor and recognize really the place that she died, which was at her apartment. And so we did a ceremonial walk to her apartment, kind of stoop, and we're able to do kind of like this burning ritual that we created together, where people were writing on little pieces of paper their wishes for her, what they wanted to say, what they hoped she would find, in the afterlife. And so little by little, people were putting them in the fire, and just watching kind of those who were, in the bigger memorial service, there was an option for an open mic, and like maybe one or two people spoke. But in this smaller setting where there was a little bit more tactile energy, I just watched as more and more people started to like feel empowered really to share their story. And even if it was something as simple as, I used to keep this note on my phone of silly quotes that she would say. And so I just wanted to read a couple of those. And like for her family to get to hear these different stories and these different pieces of her was really beautiful. And we got to like do something really tactile, which was burning. We're watching the smoke be released. It's all there's a lot of like metaphors and symbolism and action. And then we kind of, again, we were like, well, maybe we should say something collectively. Maybe we should shout something collectively. And I really, when I'm doing ceremonies or rituals with people, you plan, and then you have to also do what feels organic and what feels like it's part of, just what is naturally unfolding. And so we decided to just do a communal scream. And it was so powerful to just everyone just screaming in the streets of New York, to release that grief and that heartache of a life that was taken from us. And also like a way to kind of shout and make our voices heard. And it was really, really special. And so it was cool to watch these two different versions of kind of a memorial for the same person, but that served two very different kind of meanings and were helpful to people in different ways. And so it's again that like permission to memorialize or to do these rituals. There does not just have to be one. There can be many. It can go on for years. You could do a year, celebration of life every year to honor someone's life if you want to. Like, why do we celebrate someone's birthday every year, but then they die and then we stop celebrating them every year? Like, I really think that there's so much to be unlocked if we can kind of allow ourselves to expand in that way.
Thanks, Jamie. What an incredible example. And it brings us to the next slide too, the topic of traumatic death, violent death, stigmatized death. Worked with many families after death by suicide, death by overdose, where there has been violence, such as the example that Jamie just gave. So these are just a few images. I mean, starting with a phenomenal experience of the AIDS quilt, which has served as a template for so many other collective remembrances, where all of the individuals were so beautifully commemorated, but then collectively, the story of the trauma in the community was projected out and made visible, so literally, to so many people across the country. And then, of course, we have so much experience in our community of having to come together after acts of hate violence. The Pulse nightclub here, where again, that spontaneity that Jamie's talking about, of people just knowing they need to come together. And on the left was one of the ways that one of our own community members in Portland, known to some of us from the Lesbian Community Project days as Amazon, but more recently as T-Rex, June Knightley's work as a white ally in racial justice protests, and being essentially killed in the line of duty there at the scene. And so the question for the community was, how do we honor her and memorialize her, but in a way that incorporates the trauma that the community feels collectively? And so the Q Center played a key role in that. And I was honored to support the organizers and the MCs in thinking about the multiple kinds of grief and trauma that were going to be present, and how to keep lifting June up in the midst of that. So just quickly to continue through the continuum, the next slide, Rebecca, is the other piece that we really want to reinforce, that it is never too late. And this is an example of, after 18 years, a woman who had her own brush with mortality, and it made her recognize that her own mother's funeral 18 years earlier was, she said, like a bad Seinfeld episode, and basically had been good for nothing more than a funny story to tell at parties. And so she did a redo, and she consecrated a fountain in her backyard that she could go and have a cup of tea with her mother's memory every day. And she put together a book of her mother's favorite poetry and photos as a way of introducing to her 18-year-old son the grandmother that he had never gotten to know. And on the next slide are just some of the examples that Jamie might speak to briefly of the kind of everyday grief rituals and anniversaries, whether it's in the Jewish custom of the 1-year yahrzeit, but all the ways that we can incorporate into our daily lives, as Jamie was just saying, remembrance and honoring grief. Jamie, do you want to speak to any of these examples briefly?
Yeah, that's the thing that I think is really powerful about ritual, is that it can be done in an everyday, ordinary way. And what I work a lot with people who are grieving, and both one-on-one and in groups. And when I'm talking with people about how are you engaging in your grief, or what does grieving look like to you, a lot of people are going, I'm not really sure. And so we kind of develop these different rituals or ways to engage in their grief, and participate in that kind of relationship in a new and different way. And so when you're like thinking about the memory of someone and this grief, our society is oftentimes saying, okay, deal with it, move on, you're going to heal through, you're going to, heal and get over it. And really, I see grief as a way of actually, of holding on, of holding someone's memory, of carrying them with you kind of into this new and different world. And how do you do that? You do that through kind of engaging in ritual or finding new ways to connect with them. So whether that's creating specific altars in your house that, just even the upkeep or the taking it down and dusting it, that can be a ritual. Planting a memorial garden, gathering people together on the year anniversary of someone's death, celebrating their birthday still. I mean, I love what you were saying about the person who wanted to introduce the grandmother to their son. It's an opportunity to introduce your person to the other people in your life who may not know them, or have gotten to know them, or who also want to engage in their memory. So doing something on their birthday or on a special day or on a holiday, incorporating the dead into our everyday life, continuing to say their names, continuing to share their stories. These are all, kind of micro rituals that we do every day to, preserve the loved ones that we have. But then there are also the kind of more dedicated rituals, like letter writing to your person, at a certain time of year, or even if I know a lot of people who do letter writing kind of on a regular basis, and that is their kind of, monthly or weekly engagement in their grief, and kind of doing, having a connection with their person. And so there's really a lot of creative ways to do that, and to memorialize someone, and engage with your grief. And it really, when we can kind of take the lens off of grief just has to be one way and grieving has to be one way, and you only really do it right after someone dies, and that's the only time you can do the ritual. There's, when we unlock that, there's so much fullness beyond that, and that we really can be a part of ritual, or create rituals and change rituals and create traditions even out of it. We really carry our people with us, and that's how our community, especially, our stories deserve to be told. They deserve to be shared. And so often, historically and still currently, our stories are being trying to be stopped, and so we really deserve to kind of share in that, to engage in the grief, and to carry our people forward, our community forward, and our legacies forward.
Yeah, beautifully said, Jamie. Thanks. Well, we want to touch on just a few nuts and bolts considerations before we turn it back to Rebecca to field some of the comments that have been here and any questions. So Rebecca, on the next slide, we just want to acknowledge that we have been in a time and may continue to be in a time where using Zoom or other online ways of gathering when people can't physically gather is really helpful. And even if there weren't a pandemic, oftentimes our communities now span so many different time zones, so many different geographic locations that it can be really helpful. So some of the options are to do it 100% on Zoom or to do a hybrid where some people are in person and there's a live stream opportunity, or where the in-person event is recorded and then it's shared online for people who want to touch into it. And sometimes even people can record things in advance that can be played at the in-person. So a lot of different ways to combine technology. There are some dedicated platforms out there that have evolved to host online memorials. There are a few funeral homes that have facility for it, but most of us just DIY it ourselves. But I really strongly recommend that you have a dedicated tech person who handles the Zoom pieces like Rebecca's doing for this series, and an MC who, again, is not the most emotionally involved, so that then everybody who is the most connected can just be free to really engage and participate and not worry about the Zoom mechanics. It's also possible to do synchronized things offline. So when you think about the pandemic, people banging the pots and pans in appreciation for the first line workers at a particular time all around the world, that was happening. But the photo here is from when a friend of mine died, and he'd been in worldwide conservation and environmental activism and was beloved around the world. And so a time was set that everybody simultaneously would go outside and bring him to mind. And I went on a walk, and I just happened at that very moment to look up into the trees, and a sunbeam came down and illuminated, you can't see, but right in the middle of that is a hummingbird nest, which is not an easy thing to find, to spot. And then in the next days, as people shared what had happened to them during that dedicated moment, it was just magic everywhere. There can also be the sort of personal rituals like Jamie's talking about, but with some continuity, like everybody might make the favorite recipe of that person in their own home, or might put on like the crazy wig, on a particular day that that person's being remembered, or many times small portions of that person's ashes are distributed so that all those dear ones who wanted them can do their own personal ritual in that way. So if we can go to the next slide, Rebecca, just some of the planning considerations to reference what we've already been talking about is, are there any religious, cultural, family beliefs or traditions that might provide some framework, even if they're adapted and there's a relationship to those in a new form, but that it can often bring a lot of comfort to feel like there is a part of my tradition, and Carol spoke to this, that we can bring forward, but make sure is suitable for our own lives. It's important to consider for whose benefit is the ceremony or ritual. It's often said these days, oh, funerals are just for the living. Like there was no grief ritual when my dad died because he didn't want a funeral. And so people say, well, they're for the living. But in many cultures and throughout time, it's been believed that the ritual and ceremony that we enact in relationship to our dead is actually important for their well-being, as being well dead in the ancestor realm. And I'll always remember when Linda Campbell said to me, Holly, I have one requirement, and that's that we don't refer to Nancy in the past tense. She is still present here in a different form. And I'll always remember going to the memorial service for Portland's Mayor Vera Katz. And she was being eulogized by just a few key speakers. One of them was State Senator Margaret Carter, who'd been the first African-American woman in a number of political offices she held. She delivered her entire address, not about her friend and colleague Vera, to her friend and colleague Vera, in present tense, direct address. So there's a variety of ways to approach for whom the ceremony is being enacted. We talked about the timing before, immediately after, soon after, long after, our perspective, no wrong answer, and perhaps no one single answer either. And then who is going to design, organize, and lead it? Is it a team? Is there a team leader? Is there support needed from somebody who has more experience or can just bring a little bit more of a neutral perspective if there are a lot of different needs that need to be met? And those key questions, I think, are always really helpful as touchstones. And Carol started us out with a couple of worst case scenarios. What's the best and worst experience that you've had at a funeral or memorial? And how would you want to bring that forward and replicate that or avoid it in the worst case examples? And Rebecca, if we can go to the next slide, this is just a basic framework of some of the elements that are often included to be completely customized and adapted. And Jamie's given such beautiful examples of how important it can be to incorporate the senses. There can be water, there can be burning, there can be, ways to bring in all of the different elements, to bring in embodied pieces. But it may be helpful to think about what is the ambiance and how are people arriving and being gathered in? How are you sort of opening up the space, and how are people being welcomed? So all the different parts of the community feel included and engaged. If prayer isn't part of the tradition, is there another way to open that really allows each person to fully be present and connect with the memory of the person being honored? And sometimes nonverbal ways, candle lighting, other rituals really help with that. Is there music or a poem or a reading that either just totally evokes the personality that's being honored, or perhaps expresses something of their beliefs about life and death and this transition that they have undergone? The eulogy is, their life story and how to bring them into the center of the room in a way that's recognizable to everybody. And the slideshow can be a beautiful way to do that non-verbally with music, with images. And Carol gave an example of where that can be playing on a loop on the side. And for some people, that's the way to do it. I think there's so much value in sharing in that experience collectively. And often that is the time when the emotion can really flow. And that can be complemented by remarks either curated and planned or spontaneous. There can be some pros and cons to that kind of open mic approach. I always recommend, if you're going to do it, you have a couple of people that are going to speak, because nothing hurts worse than having awkward silence and or having that space filled by people who they might have an agenda, actually, in terms of what they need to say. An alternative to that I think can work well is have toasts and tributes later during the reception time, when everybody is not all sort of seated and captive, and it can happen a little bit more organically. It can be helpful to think about how to bring to a close. And again, there may be closing rituals or music and prayers. And so this is just a framework to start to say, I do and I don't want that, or what would be our version of how to do that if there's a kind of a focused program. And what do we have next, Rebecca? I think we just wanted to start to point you to, a few resources and options. Of course, throughout time, it's been very conventional to have a significant death notice in the paper of record, but that's no longer offered as a community service unless you're a person of note like Darcel, or making news like Linda Campbell. And it's now a significant part of media outlets' advertising revenue. And I've had many families where the obituary that they wanted to print in the paper actually cost more than the cremation. It was the most expensive element of the entire death. And so what many families do is use something online. So every funeral home, cremation service will offer at no extra charge, posting the obituary on their website. People are going to have to see their ads, but unlimited space, unlimited photos, and then purchasing in the paper of record can be a very short blurb with the URL for the complete obituary. There are folks that have personal websites or are using social media where the tribute can go there, or Caring Bridge, or lots of helping hands if those have been used to keep the community involved and informed during the dying time is often where people find the obituary goes best. Lastly, there are a lot of online memorial sites cropping up, and often posting the obituary there is free. And then they try to sell additional services like online streaming for a memorial. And lastly, before I turn back to Jamie and Carol for any thoughts they want to add, Rebecca, on the next slides, we have a couple of where to find more information. So in session 3, we told you more about Oregon Funeral Resources and Education, which is at oregonfuneral.org, which is a totally non-commercial, free public information website. And under the How To tab, you can see how to create ceremony. And there's a lot of these frameworks and things that we've been talking about here and links to examples. And then on the next slide, Rebecca, you can see that under Learn More, there was a full pandemic care guide that we created for the years that we were locked down. And one of those, part of the pandemic care guide, is ceremony resources for when a funeral is not possible. And a lot of that does remain relevant today. And then the last resource we want to share with you is a wonderful, again, non-commercial website called inspiredfuneral.com. And for all the different kind of categories of ceremony that you see there, there are lots of poems and readings and songs, and just kind of a library of ideas that might be helpful. So Rebecca's putting those links in the chat. And Rebecca, we can stop the screen share. And before you start to field our comments, I want to see Jamie and Carol if there is anything more you wanted to add.
Go ahead, Carol, if you'd like.
No, okay, go ahead. I'm still formulating my
Oh, well, yeah, I just I really hope that the takeaway for anyone in this session is really to feel empowered in knowing that there are so many different options out there, and that there are a lot of beautiful ways and unique ways to have memorial services, to ritualize within your grief, and that there are a lot of folks out there, celebrants like Holly and I, who are able to kind of help connect those dots for people, and to have to kind of be the keeper of the space and that kind of like team leader, as Holly was saying. And it can be incredibly helpful in the planning, because, when you're grieving, even if you've planned everything in advance, that grief is still going to be, enormous. And we want you to participate in the ritual, as yourself, as your grieving self. And so having someone who is a little bit removed, but able to still, really embody what you are wanting, or what your person was wanting in that kind of ceremony or ritual, can be a really powerful and beneficial thing.
Okay, just following up a little bit then about what you said about a beneficial thing. I think that trying to do some kind of a memorial at the end of a person's life, a celebration of who they were, can be very, very beneficial. And instead of just they're going away and no one recognizes it, no one acknowledges all the contributions that person has made, no one talks about the impact that person has had in your life or the community's life. It's just a wonderful way to bring that kind of, I don't want to say closure, but helpful in the transition to whatever the new relationship is going to be. And I think any kind of a ritual that you plan or have contributes to that considerably.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna also just plug a Friendly House for a minute, but grief can be an incredibly difficult thing for anyone, but especially those who are in our community. And oftentimes we are not able to access the resources that a lot of other people have, or you go, I've heard horror stories of people going to hospice grief groups and not having their person recognized because of what their relationship was or whatever. And so Friendly House does have a LGBTQ grief group for 55 plus. And, you know, there are growing and more grief support for the queer community, for the LGBTQIA plus community. And it's really important that we also have those dedicated spaces where we can really feel free and affirmed in our very unique grief experiences and our unique relationships with the people that we love.
Thank you all so much for all of the amazing words of this series, but especially this part in particular. What a great sharing of resources, but also all of these different experiences just makes me think so much about what I want, what I need going forward. And I know that so many people in the chat are saying the same thing. So thank you so much.